Wuppertal in the Cederberg Mountains of South Africa, a place where history is being made. And in the driver's seat of this story is an unassuming bush called rooibos.
Over these years, Wuppertal remained undisturbed, beautiful area. For generations, we rely on rooibos tea, not only as a source of income. The rooibos, this miracle plant, is part of our heritage, it's part of us. It runs in our blood.
Knowledge has come out very, very strongly as one of the key things that define the San and the Khoi, which they've got and which are valuable for the world.
There was recognition that most of the world's biodiversity was in the countries of the south, but it was being exploited to the benefit of countries of the north.
The people of South Africa are taking momentous steps to redress this north-south imbalance, to be recognized and rewarded for their rooibos traditional knowledge.
The kind of knowledge that is held over thousands of years usually by a community which has passed the knowledge down over generations, and they passed it down orally, and they also shared it.
En hy is baie goed vir ekseem, is hy net so goed. Kinders wat ekseem het. En vir hare wat die hare was, dan kan jy die rooibos tee ook vat en was jou hare daarin vir die skilvers.
Nee, ek sê rooibos tee is direk van die Here vir die armen.
Die wilde tee is die wonder van rooibos. Dan sal jy net sê, I love this one. Ja, hy is regtig uniek.
With modern times, it's become seen as a source of intellectual property rights because it does have a value, and there's something unfair when someone else uses the value without compensation.
And the idea was that any company wanting to use the indigenous resources of another would have to get access, but in return for access they would have to give benefits.
Dit was verskriklike baie navorsing wat gedoen was om seker te maak dit is die Khoisan, die Khoi en die San se tradisionele kennis.
All the indigenous peoples are claiming is acknowledgement and an appropriate benefit.
Maar hierso sit 'n stukkie goud wat ons moet vertroetel. Ja.
So it took quite a while, I can say this, before the rooibos industry agreed to sit down and acknowledge that the San and the Khoi are the TK traditional knowledge holders regarding rooibos, and that therefore in accordance with the law they need to sit down and negotiate.
We must talk, and I think in our interaction and talk to each other we can find a common ground, how we can solve this problem.
Finding common ground has been aided by a landmark report commissioned by the South African government. And any day now, the talks between the Khoi and San nations, the holders of the traditional knowledge and the commercial rooibos industry, will produce a historic agreement.
Given the fact that we received acknowledgement from the rooibos industry, we will now enter into more serious talks on how the real benefit sharing agreement will be rolled out. And the parties that will be involved in this discussion will be the National Khoisan Council, the San Council, and the Rooibos Council.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final plenary session. I'm Ted Piccone. I'm the new Chief Engagement Officer with the World Justice Project, and this is my first World Justice Forum, and I'm very excited to get a chance to meet all of you over these many days and in the months to come as we continue to build this movement for justice and rule of law around the world. We're here this afternoon to talk about some issues that revolve around Indigenous rights and ways in which those rights can be acknowledged, and the question of the traditional knowledge that these Indigenous groups hold and how they can share in the benefits of those, that knowledge. To talk about this issue, I'm very happy to introduce Pooven Moodley. Pooven started his activism at a young age in the anti-apartheid movement, and he's had it in his blood for a long time to fight for rights and justice in the field of particularly humanitarian issues, working for Oxfam and Action Aid International, and he currently runs a group called Natural Justice. This is not in the written program, it's on the app with more information. Natural Justice is a group that started based in South Africa, but working throughout Africa on bringing law and justice issues to the environment and Indigenous communities. Pooven, maybe we could start, this is a great introduction, by telling us a little bit about the context of this issue, specifically around rooibos, the history of exploitation of traditional knowledge in this case.
Yeah, let me start by saying I'm really happy to be here, and it's amazing the inspirational stories I've heard over the last few days from different countries, and it really inspires and gives hope. This rooibos movie was finally finished a few months ago, and there was a screening in Cape Town in South Africa where a lot of the communities affected by this issue were at the screening, and a big part of it was a very emotional evening, and a lot of it was, about the issue of dignity and justice, which, it's more than, anything around access and benefit sharing, but just those fundamental human rights. So the San and Khoi communities, unfortunately, representatives couldn't be here during this forum, but hopefully in future forums. Goes back a long time. The San and Khoi communities are known to be one of the oldest living communities on the planet. And there's a very strong history of brutality from, two sets of colonization. At some stage in the mid-1600s, it was a sport in South Africa to hunt and kill Khoi and San people. That's the level of brutality. But later on, it was, these are traditional hunting and gathering communities who were then restricted based on geographic boundaries to move from area to area, so their life was restricted. And then on top of that, with all of the apartheid laws, there was more brutality and restriction, and often these communities were kicked out of the areas they lived in, even quite recently. So there's been a series of struggles in terms of their access to land, the places they live in, and even over the last few years, there's been many cases to try and ensure that Khoi and San people can live in areas where they always lived, and to continue the way they would want to live their lives. So, in terms of rooibos, this is a massive issue for them. It started, around in a number of areas. So one, on the global level, and it's really important based on the themes coming out of this conference, how global agreements have a bearing on communities around the world. So at the global level, there was a Convention on Biological Diversity, which was signed and countries ratified, not all countries. And then in 2010, there was the Nagoya Protocol that was negotiated as well, that spoke about fair and equitable sharing of access and benefit sharing, especially around genetic resources. And in this case, in South Africa, it was around rooibos. So that was happening, and then at the same time, national legislation was being put in place in South Africa. And while we were working with the Khoi and San around a range of issues, including land, we started this discussion about traditional knowledge. Given for centuries, they've been using rooibos not just as a tea, but in a range of medicinal ways. And that knowledge was recorded by a researcher. Many years later, there was a company that took that research and then started, the rooibos industry, which is now a massive industry.
Yeah, let me just ask for a show of hands. How many of you have heard of rooibos tea before today? That's a big show of hands. Okay. I assume you all enjoy it, and it's become very popular, but it all started with the Khoi and San communities in South Africa. So can you say a bit, this is an interesting case where both national and international law were used to leverage rights. Can you say a bit more about how you applied these legal frameworks in that context?
Yeah, so, we were very involved in the process of negotiating the Nagoya Protocol as well, and exactly looking at communities like this, that have traditional knowledge that's been passed on from generation to generation, but which has been, in many cases, taken over by companies. So you have multi-billion-dollar industries with no recognition of traditional rights. So in the South African context, we, had many discussions with the Department of Environmental Affairs based on the national law in South Africa around ensuring the link is made and that it's documented. So part of the report you've seen in the movie was a study done to go back in history, to look at the process of how traditional knowledge was passed on by the Khoi and San and how that's now been used within the rooibos industry. So that was a really important process. I think at the same time, the discussions with the rooibos industry itself, on the one hand, the rooibos industry has to get permits from government to trade and be processors of rooibos. So that helped our cause in ensuring all the parties are on the table to have a discussion around this. But also there is a feeling from the rooibos industry that it is time to give back. It is, fair and equitable. And, it's been a long and hard journey because, obviously in terms of issues around intellectual property, patents, those are very complex issues and, a lot of contestation. But I think, it's at a point where there's agreement by all of the parties in terms of the communities, the industry, but also in terms of government, that this is best for everyone and something that we have to do.
So you had the basic principle of fair access to benefits on the table. You had a sympathetic, it sounds like, government ministry that was recognizing that there was a real traditional knowledge here that deserved to be recognized. And then you had an industry that had to come to the table because of this permitting process. And then you have civil society pushing on behalf of the communities themselves to advocate for rights. A negotiation process has taken place over many years. I don't know if you want to say a bit more about how that went down.
Yeah. So at this stage, I can say a few things, but given that, the process is still ongoing, but, reaching a culmination point. Essentially, it's been around a 7-year process, with these different parties coming together, doing studies, having these discussions and negotiations. And it's not been easy. There have been, as I said, many, difficult, contentious issues at different points. We kind of felt like, okay, this may not work. But, we're now at a point where we're very close to, let me say, the end point around, having some kind of agreement, which in many ways will be a precedent-setting agreement because while there have been some agreements with individual companies, this agreement is with a whole industry, which we haven't heard of any other cases in the world. So it will set a massive precedent for indigenous communities, not just in Africa, but I think across the globe.
That's really exciting. But can you also say a bit about some of the challenges that you faced in pulling this together?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially with the Khoi and San communities, these are communities scattered all along southern Africa, in different locations, in often very remote places. There isn't one kind of key leadership structure. And so that's been really difficult because it has meant, some of the leaders from these communities having to reach out to go to different parts of the country, but also beyond, to ensure that, the community is together on this in terms of, this is the direction and let's kind of move together, on the issue. So that in itself. There has been a lot of work done setting up over many years and has been now in existence for several years, the San Council and the Khoi San Council as well. So that's been a very difficult, long, but we've come a long way in that sense. I think, in terms of with the industry, as I said, that's been really difficult as well. And this has been kept silent for a long time, obviously because of the nature of the negotiations, and will only be made public as we get closer to finishing the agreement and as it's launched, which will be a big deal for communities when it is launched in South Africa. But yeah, so it was a case of giving and taking and coming to obviously each side making some compromises. And in the end, it's, it'll probably be, a fairest deal that would be possible under the circumstances. It's not going to be, the perfect thing. But it does mean it's a process, and it does mean that, for generations to come, especially Khoi and San communities, but will benefit from the agreement.
Was there an element that was about mobilization of public opinion? Was that part of your strategy, or was it pretty well acknowledged, since you were dealing with a sympathetic government agency, that it really wasn't the problem?
Yeah, I think government came on board pretty well in the sense of engaging with the San and Khoi San Council, but also coming on board, ensuring that communities are being consulted. And as I said, a lot of energy went into, trying to reach out to as many communities as possible across the country, which, hasn't been easy.
So today is our day to focus on commitments, and I asked Pooven if he could share with us some of the work that the Natural Justice is doing, looking ahead, and what commitments they're making in other parts of Africa. Maybe you could share with us some of those examples.
Yeah, I think quite a few of them have come during the week by other people as well in the room. I think given the planetary crisis we're currently in, there's certainly people starting to listen to indigenous communities much more, based on the wisdom, based on how we relate to nature, and that's certainly coming to the fore. In many of the countries we're working in, a lot of the cases are indigenous people being kicked out of forests because those forests are being cut down. Cases in Kenya, for example, in a World Heritage Site on an island called Lamu, where there's massive infrastructure projects, coal, oil and gas, massive highways, and so on to extract, resources from the country. And, right in the center of that are indigenous communities who, their land, fisherfolk, farmers, small-scale farmers, are not being consulted. People are being kicked out of their land. So our commitment as Natural Justice is to continue doing the work we do, basically to stand behind indigenous and local communities. And we see this as kind of, a line of the battleground, especially over the next decade, as the, resource extraction machine continues to accelerate, while at the same time, our planet starts or continues in an accelerated way to fall apart. I think this is a crucial decade. And so, our commitment is really to stand behind many communities as we can, using a range of different strategies.
Well, I think the agreement that you're negotiating and finalizing with the government, the point you made about it setting a precedent, really could be a tipping point for recognizing, hopefully not just at a national or even continental level, but at a global level, that there needs to be recognition of this traditional knowledge, and that there are formulas for agreements that, based on good principles of international and national law, will give some benefit to these indigenous communities, and allow industries to thrive as well and create employment. And it sounds to me like a very good win-win opportunity that we all can learn from. Thank you, Pooven, for this discussion. Please join me in a round of applause for the work they've done.
Thank you.
And we will turn the podium over to William.
Ted, thank you very much, and Pooven, thank you for your inspiring work.